Good day, citizens, and good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners. And as I always say, thank you for listening.
Indeed. I have been really interested in new books on Thomas Jefferson. We're going to have more authors on this program. Next week's program is about common sense.
Right.
Thomas Paine's great pamphlet.
Our book series.
And that you read it, as I understand it.
I did.
Read it out loud.
I thought that would be a nice thing to do and to offer to our 1776 Club members. And if you would like to support the Thomas Jefferson Hour, please go to jeffersonhour.com, click on donate. You can support the show that way. You can become a 1776 Club member, and you will have access to this audiobook version of Common Sense. And I hope you enjoy it.
And more cultural tours are coming. We've reorganized the cultural tours. We've got the summer trip coming. That's full.
Yeah, usually you're telling everybody about the Lewis and Clark, but it's sold out.
It's all
so
full up,
fast.
but there'll be one next year. But the two winter humanities retreats in January at Lochsaw Lodge, just west of Missoula, are still open. One is on water in the West, which is one of the great. It was already one of the interesting and complicated subjects. Now it's more so because of global climate change. And then Shakespeare, a second year on Shakespeare's drama. So go to the website. Also, the Steinbeck trip, March 3 through 9, 2019 in Monterey.
What's your favorite Steinbeck book?
Oh, for me?
Yes.
Without question, The Grapes of Wrath. How about you?
I don't know. That may be, Cannery Row.
Russ is Cannery Row. So yeah. Russ, who's my partner in that trip.
Yeah, I had occasion to open that up and reread it. I think it
Travels with Charlie is a great book.
Yeah. Anyway.
I'm not an East of Eden guy, but some are. But I love Tortilla Flat. I love Of Mice and Men. But
you are so well read. Quit showing off.
I read them all when I started to portray Steinbeck.
Uh-huh.
And I saved The Grapes of Wrath for last, thinking maybe I won't have time. I'll read all the rest.
Yeah.
I did have time, and when I read The Grapes of Wrath, I thought, no, it is by far the best thing he wrote, and one of the great books in the history of American literature. There is nothing like it. None of his other. I like a lot of his other work, of course, but if you were only one Steinbeck book, in my opinion, it has to be The Grapes of Wrath.
On this week's show, we answered listener questions, several of them. We got one about John Quincy Adams. That was
fun.
Fun to talk about.
Hated Jefferson, basically.
And what was the other one we started with? Greg Tomberlin.
About whether these were average people on an extraordinary moment or geniuses who happened to live then.
Yeah, and I think there's, you answered that pretty firmly, but I think there's probably a little bit of truth in both of those. And towards the end of the show, we talk with Beau Wright.
So Beau Wright, we met when he was a listener, and he had written us a letter.
He wrote us a letter, and I reached out to him.
You reached out. We had him on the show, and then he ran for city council.
In Lynchburg.
In Lynchburg, of all places, which is where Poplar Forest is, Jefferson's retreat home.
I think it's safe to say he's fairly liberal.
And that's not a liberal town.
And he got elected.
So he must have kept his mouth shut.
Nobody listens to the Jefferson Hour.
Don't think he said what he actually feels about life.
That's not. The guy he's a fair guy.
He's a great guy.
Yeah,
but let me say this: he's clearly a liberal. There's no question about that.
Yeah,
he worked for the Obama administration for 6 years, quite high up.
Yeah, he started at the bottom.
We would like some conservative commentators on this show. I'd like to hear from someone who's been in the White House, who still believes in it. Still believes in this president and this administration, but is not part of the Kool-Aid at the moment. We really can talk about what it's like to try to be a communications person within the conservative movement at the present time.
Which leads me to the last part of the podcast intro, warning this could go on for a little while. We got quite a bit of correspondence about that show that we talked about Truth Matters, right?
Show, because we had said about the Washington Post's list of the
that was one of
untruths.
The things. We got a great letter from Rebecca Dupree thanking us. She included a quote from Jefferson. He wrote to John Adams October 28th, 1813, during their reconciliation. He said, Jefferson wrote, "There is also an artificial aristocracy founded on wealth and birth." You know this quote.
Right. This is natural aristocracy versus pseudo-aristocracy.
The artificial aristocracy is a mischievous ingredient in government, and provision should be made to prevent its ascendancy.
Right. And we have a meritocracy. I mean, Thomas Friedman wrote a great book called The Lexus and the Olive Tree, and at the end he has this chapter about why America is still the world's meritocracy. And it's a beautiful essay. Everyone should read this. And he says basically, in America, if you have talent and you work hard at it, there's a very good chance that you'll be able to rise economically, socially, politically, in terms of material comforts, in terms of the prestige of your work, that America is still the world's merit awarder, that we reward merit here more than Britain, more than France, more than Germany. Not that they don't, but that the American dream is still very much alive for people who have merit. And Jefferson wanted a meritocracy and wanted to destroy a culture that was based on inherited privilege, and he won. That we still remain one of the great nations in the world for this purpose.
There were a number of letters that
were more negative.
Yeah, they were pretty upset.
Why? What exactly was?
Well, one gentleman who asked not to be named. We exchanged a number of emails.
What was his point?
Well, one of his things that he was very upset with is that we mentioned this Washington Post article 3,000 times. Right, yeah.
He disputes that.
He says the New York Times and the Washington Post both loathe him, yet I'm supposed to trust they'll report on him and his policies objectively. Your intellect and intuition should lead you to other conclusions.
You know what I want to say about this? I want to ask our listeners. This is not a rhetorical question. And I'm asking you, it's not a rhetorical question. Do you think that the Washington Post and the New York Times are out to destroy Trump? It's a good question.
Yeah, as a leading motive, we are not talking about an institution. We are talking about individuals. And to say that every individual at any news publication has that kind of motive, it just cannot be true. Are there some people? I'm certain that there are.
But do you think institutionally there would be glee if they could bring down Donald Trump? I'm asking our listeners too.
I was thinking about that the other day, and I lived in Washington, D.C. during the time of Watergate, and had it not been for a free press, the Washington Post in particular, our government would have gotten away with it, something they shouldn't have gotten away with.
But I agree with the conservatives to a certain degree on this, that the Clintons and the Clinton Foundation have been protected by the media to a certain degree.
Yeah, I think that's probably true.
And that there is kind of a sense that, because we like the Clintons and they're basically for the world we want.
They got away with it, and we're not letting this guy get away with it.
That the scrutiny is different for different people, that Obama in many respects got a pass by some of the media, and the Clintons have gotten a pass, and now here's Trump. And clearly Trump is upsetting to the establishment, so they're going after him viciously.
Steve wrote me, and he had a list of these things. I'm not suggesting your bias is intentional. However, there is, I believe, a bias of omission present in your discussion.
Let's hear a few.
I can't help but wonder why you and members of the mainstream media
We're not mainstream.
We're not even media. Are not similarly affronted and moved to share your thoughts on air by the Attorney General of the United States being charged with contempt of court.
There was a problem for Eric Holder, and that's not good.
Or the head of the IRS pleading protection under the Fifth Amendment when being questioned about the illegal misdeeds of the organization she led.
I'm not certain that that's true, but I know that is a concern.
Or, as you talked to Beau about, that matter the president proclaiming now infamously, if you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor.
You know what? I thought about this. I have kept my doctor. Have you kept your doctor?
Yeah, well,
I think most people got to keep their doctor.
I don't know.
But look, I think they're right. I think that Donald Trump has appalled a certain type of establishment figure, and that they want him gone, and they will be glad when he goes, and that they would like to see him flame out. I think there's no question about that. But remember, the right felt the same way about Obama.
Well, he says, we are clearly living in a time when the news media unabashedly have taken sides, a state of affairs which cannot be healthy for a representative republic. Okay, agreed. But who has the highest ratings of any news organization in the United States? It's Fox. I mean, you can make the argument.
But you don't want to get into that. You want to get back to a situation where the media is essentially trying to be even-handed at all times.
Agreed. But
we don't have that now.
We have this catchphrase of mainstream media, and they're all awful.
I just don't. My politics are somewhat to the left of Donald Trump.
I've watched you, and you've gotten more conservative over the years.
I am conservative. I am conservative, and I want to be fair, and I do hold the Obama administration accountable, and I hold the Clintons accountable. And so it bothers me when the left gives a pass to the people they like just because they like them, and then they are incredibly hard on the people they don't like just because they don't like them. I want at least equal opportunity scrutiny. If that's the nature of the culture, let's go after all of them. But no one deserves to be mollycoddled in their system. And I think Fox is deplorable, but I think that a lot of what happens on MSNBC is equally deplorable. I just feel like the right first of all, I understand their anger. I understand the anger of the angry Americans. I don't share it because this is like the best of all possible times in the history of the world, but I understand it. I also understand why they think that the system is rigged, that something like CNN tries at times to be even-handed, but has really lost that battle with even-handedness. I watch it and I think, wow, that is left of center, no question. And so I think they have a reason to be upset, and they don't like when the mainstream media says, oh no, we're perfectly objective. What's your problem? I think that is galling and it's wrong.
So to close this out, if you have an opinion that you would like aired or shared, go to jeffersonhour.com or call us, leave us a voicemail, get in contact with us. We really do want to hear from you. We want to be fair.
I don't think Jefferson is a leftist in our time. I don't want to make Jefferson a liberal. I think Jefferson was an enlightened man, but there is some distinction between the tribalism of the liberals and the enlightenment of Jefferson. And so I would like to hear from principled, idealistic conservatives who are not just going to bash Obama or bash Clinton or bash this or that. I want to hear how Jefferson inspires conservative people. I want to know that, and I don't want them to feel like this show is rigged for liberalism, because I don't even feel that. I do the program to search. I am with Jefferson. Civility, rationality, science, harmony, majority rule. America has a special destiny in the world, and the world looks to us. I think they're a little disappointed with us right now. I think they're confused about who we are. I do think there's a tribal crisis in the country where most of the establishment does despise President Trump, and maybe for good reason, but it creates a disharmony in a nation that needs to seek out new forms of consensus. I guess that's my point of view.
Yep, one at a time, right? One at a time. Right.
Let's listen to the show.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson, or your weekly conversation with the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, the gentleman seated across from me now, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. And were I talking to the president, Clay, I would say, I hope all is well at your home and your garden is growing well.
I can tell you as a citizen, not as Thomas Jefferson, that my garden is in, partly thanks to you. You gave me a number of tomato cuttings, and I have dutifully planted them. Late this year, we're recording this Jefferson Hour in the first week of June 2018. I've never planted a garden so late as I did this year. I've just been unbelievably busy traveling and so on.
And we always get a little ahead on programs this time of the year because you have such a busy summer. You have your
wandering about with the
Lewis and Clark tour,
annual tour,
which is filled to capacity, I understand.
It is. We've done this, I think, 16 years in a row.
You have a couple others coming up we could maybe talk about later in the program, but your Loxa Lodge and then...
the two winter retreats at this lodge west of Missoula, one on water in the west, and the other one on Shakespeare, and then the John Steinbeck tour, which is March 3 through 9, 2019, not this year, but next year, March 3 through 9, a whole week in Steinbeck's, California, which is just, I've done it once before. It's a great, great trip.
And as always, if you want to find out more about that, go to jeffersonhour.com.
It's good to see you here. We're not in the barn today because I'm not Jefferson. I didn't have to put on the wig and tights. And
the air conditioning's a little better down here.
The odors are certainly better in the studio. But it's always great to see you, David, and your garden is flourishing. Well, you've eaten from the garden already.
Well, yeah, a little bit here and there. Yeah, I've got a lot of stuff growing, and it's great fun. And nothing better than to go home in the shank of the evening and walk among those plants and take
pull out
a look
a couple of spinach leaves
and more like weeds. Anyway, we have a whole bunch of listener mail in front of us. And I was hoping that with your approval, sir, this week we might answer a few questions.
Indeed, let's do it.
We have one from Greg Tomberlin.
Greg Tomberlin.
And he writes, in Hollywood, being a great actor doesn't always get you an Oscar unless you get the right role. Agreed?
Robert De Niro did some great films early in his career and has done schlock almost ever since. But he's one of the greatest actors of our time.
He is. He goes on, conversely, a reasonably good actor might get an Oscar if they land a great role in a great movie. And his question is, the Founding Fathers are revered as an all-star team of liberty, but I wonder if they might have just landed the greatest political roles ever and were not all-stars. Does their legacy stand by itself, or were they ordinary without the greatness of the time?
I think Jefferson would say, if he were here, we were men like other men. We had strengths, we had weaknesses, we had good days and bad days, we had prejudices and bigotries, we had all the foibles of humankind and some of the nobility. And I think Jefferson might quote Dr. Johnson. Dr. Johnson, the British lexicographer, said of a man who was writing really brilliant sermons 2 weeks before his hanging, he said, knowing you are to be hanged in a fortnight concentrates the mind wonderfully. So the Founding Fathers concentrated their minds because they were living through this crisis, and it brought out much of the best in American culture. George Washington became the father of his country and won that long war of attrition. John Adams became one of the great legislative constitution makers in human history. Madison, who was just a very shy, kind of diminutive, withdrawn, reserved sort of fellow, turns out to be the father of the Constitution and the author of the Bill of Rights. And then you have America's Da Vinci, Thomas Jefferson. So I think Jefferson would say the moment made us more than we would have been if it had just been a routine moment in human history. But you and I don't have to agree with that, David.
Well, I actually think it's a pretty interesting question to consider, and also in this time for you and I, because next week we're doing another one of the Jefferson Hour book clubs
on Thomas Paine's Common Sense.
Right. So both of us have been studying up on common sense, and it's
not to anticipate, but here's Thomas Paine, who is, you would never have expected that he would wind up being sort of the inspiration, the articulator of one of the greatest moments in human history. If you had just looked at him at the time that he met Ben Franklin in London. Paine was down and out, poor, had been fired from several jobs, had 2 failed marriages. And he meets Dr. Franklin, and Franklin says, you should relocate in the United States. You should come to America. And it turns out then Paine rises to the occasion. He's kind of a latecomer to the revolutionary cause, and he produces Common Sense, which was, he said himself, maybe the best-selling book in the history of the world up to his time. It's no longer the case, but he sold about 500,000 copies of that book, didn't take any profits. He refused to take a profit from it. He would have been well off had he done so. But who would have thought that Paine would wind up being the great Thomas Paine? Who would have thought that Madison, this kind of exceedingly private and shy and nervous kind of person, would wind up being the father of the American Constitution, or the Jefferson, he's sort of Carl Sagan plus Einstein plus Robert Oppenheimer, that he would descend into the world of statesmanship and wind up writing the most important document in the history of human freedom.
Yeah, but back to Mr. Tomberlin's question, does their legacy stand by itself, or were they ordinary without the greatness of the time? And I bring up Common Sense kind of a promo for next week's show, but also I think that's some insight into the American public needed to be persuaded.
They weren't ready.
Yeah.
I mean, John Adams was deeply frustrated in 1775 and in fact right up into June of 1776 that the American people still wanted to reconcile. They didn't want to break with Britain. They thought of themselves as British citizens, and they were angry and frustrated, but they thought, we'll work it out. The British ministry and the king will come to their senses and we'll continue down this path. And most of the country wasn't ready for revolution. They had to be pushed. John Adams found this appalling. Jefferson was a little more thoughtful about it, as always. But I mean, I really disagree with the idea that these were ordinary men who did extraordinary things. They weren't. Jefferson knew 7 languages. If he had done nothing else, he would be regarded as one of the greatest architects in American history. If he had done nothing else, he'd be regarded as our first-grade wine connoisseur. If he had done nothing else, he would be regarded as the father of American paleontology. This is not an average human being who was exalted because of the crisis of the times. Others were. John Adams wasn't an average human being. George Washington wasn't an average human being. Abigail Adams wasn't an average human being. I mean, this was a special cluster of people. Now, there were 2 or 3 or 4 million average Americans at this time that you never have read about and never will. But we were able, here's my point, I think, David, we were able to distill from amongst us a leadership cadre of remarkable talent. I don't think that's always the case, and I don't think it's the case now, and I don't just mean the current president, I mean in our time, because people of genius today don't become senators, don't become governors, don't become vice president, don't become president.
Careful, you're doing an overgeneralization there.
It's true. People of genius are in foundations, they're writers, they're musicians, they're poets, they're artists, they're Bill Gates, they're Steve Jobs. There is such a realm of possibility in achievement for people of genius and talent and discipline now. And there is a kind of a distaste about public life that's for hacks. That's for...
So you're saying there's different ways of contributing to society now other than just serving in government.
Right, that statesmanship was more central then than it is now. We had a better sense of statesmen then, that we didn't regard them as a bunch of hacks. It's a whole different world. But it's also the case that the other point that's being made in the letter is maybe that time really did bring out the very best in a whole range of people we might not otherwise have heard about.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and it led me to think about it, and it led me back to this book by an author I know you have a lot of respect for, Gordon S. Wood.
Oh, sure.
And his book, The Radicalism of the American Revolution. And I open it up to the introduction, and he writes, "We Americans like to think of our revolution as not being radical. Indeed, most of the time we consider it downright conservative. It certainly does not appear to resemble the revolution of other nations, in which people were killed, property destroyed, and everything was turned upside down. The American Revolution leaders do not fit our conventional image of revolutionaries: angry, passionate, reckless, maybe even bloodthirsty for the sake of a cause."
I do believe it was a conservative revolution compared to, say, the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution. But on the other hand, these were radical ideas that humans are up to the business of governing themselves. Thomas Paine was maybe the most democratic of all of them, and I don't want to get ahead of ourselves for next week's program, but Paine believed that if you took a list of 200 or 300 people and picked one, that person was up to the task of being senator or being governor or being representative, that you didn't have to be born into the elite, that average people are up to the task of governing themselves. That's a radical notion. It's not entirely believed in our own time, is it? We have the Kennedys, we have the Bushes. We believe that there's a kind of an elite the Clintons, who somehow are more likely to be great leaders than somebody you pick out of the phone book in Billings, Montana. Paine would say, wait a minute, it's probably just the reverse. So there is a radicalism to this notion, and Paine's attack on privilege as the foundation of leadership is maybe his most important argument in his famous book issued on January 10th, 1776, Common Sense.
One other bit from his introduction. "There should no longer be any doubt about it. The white American colonists were not an oppressed people. They had no crushing imperial chains to throw off. In fact, the colonists knew they were freer, more equal, more prosperous, and less burdened with cumbersome feudal and monarchical restraints than any other part of mankind in the 18th century."
Indeed, that's true. When we transplanted ourselves from Europe to the New World, we really did have a chance to start again. And we were automatically more egalitarian than Europe had ever been. And we were able to break with some of the worst habits of the past and the worst institutions because of that transforming voyage for 3,000 miles.
Great question from Greg Tomberlin. Right now, we're going to take a short break, but we'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation, well, this week with the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. And we're answering listener questions this week, and we got one from a longtime listener who's volunteered help and kept in touch with us over the years.
Brooke Prumnitz.
A friend of yours, too, I understand.
Yeah, we've corresponded over many years, and so here's her question. In Joseph Ellis's book, First Family, and also his book, Passionate Sage, there's mention of Abigail Adams and Mr. Jefferson visiting shortly before the end of the Adams presidency. I don't recall hearing about this meeting on the show and was wondering if Mr. Jefferson could share more about the meeting with his listeners. Well, remember, and I always say, David, is that these people lived in a Jane Austen novel.
Right.
They were always polite. They were always civil. Manners meant much more in this period than they mean now. And people, when they did social calls, we would say there was a kind of a frigidity to it, a kind of formality that is hard for us to understand in our much more basic and vulgar and straightforward era. So by this time, Abigail Adams is really disgusted with Jefferson, hates him maybe. Jefferson doesn't feel the same way about Abigail Adams. He feels, hey, bygones, we're friends, we're old friends. Why would you be upset? So he appears because it's important for him to pay a social call on Mrs. Adams before she leaves Washington. So he does. And she met him. We don't have a full account of the event, but I'm certain that it was civil.
Oh boy, I'd love to have a tape recording of that conversation.
But I'll bet there was body language.
I'll bet.
I'll bet she made it clear to him that she was not happy and they were no longer friends. But she would not have said, "How dare you do what you did to my husband, you unscrupulous atheist." That doesn't happen in Jefferson's world, and he wouldn't put up with it. If she had shown any disrespect to him, he would have said, "Madam, I find that I have other things I must do this afternoon. You will please excuse me," and he would have bowed his way out. So you have to imagine a kind of frigidly civil, formal event in which each person is better than they really might want to be with respect to the other. But I can't believe that Abigail Adams, who was one of the most honest people in American history, didn't make it clear to Jefferson that he was an unwanted guest at this moment. Now, later they worked it out. Many, many, many years later, they became friends again, but it took a long period of processing and forgiveness before either side was really able to like or trust the other. John Adams wasn't there. Had he been there, it would have been a very different dynamic because he and Jefferson always had things to talk about. Adams probably would have held forth. Jefferson was not the kind of person who holds forth. Adams would have filled the vacuum with discourse. Jefferson, we know from all the first-person accounts we have of all the witnessing, was a very cautious, self-protective, civil, mild, and benevolent man always tried, his motto was take things always by their smooth handle. So no matter how difficult the situation, Jefferson's thinking, let's be harmonious. Let's get along. Let's say the decent things here. Let's not quarrel. I'm not taking the bait. I'm not going to strike out. I just want to show respect and then go home and not have to regret any tensions that otherwise might have been here. He's a Virginian. The New Englanders, like John and Abigail Adams, were much more candid people. And so you just have to, as you say, wouldn't it have been great to be a witness to this? I would have just loved to watch her try to be nice to Thomas Jefferson.
It certainly would answer a lot of questions, wouldn't it?
Yeah, but let me say something else about that since we're out of character. Sometimes there's a friendship which is broken and you no longer trust. But there was a depth to it at one time, and you realize that even however angry you are at this person or disenchanted or whatever, that there still is that fund of something that was really powerful and positive at one time. And then you lament that it's gone and you wish that it could be restored, but it can't. But you're not going to scream at that person because the fund of goodwill is considerable. And so I'm guessing that, John Adams eventually said during the negotiations that led to the renewal of the friendship, he said, I love Jefferson. I've always loved him.
Right.
You can hear him saying that.
Yes.
I've always loved him. I'm mad at him. I'd like to string him up and slit his throat. He betrayed me. He hired that goon Calendar to write dirt about me. And he won the presidency by being a demagogue, and he's not a good president either, and he's naive, and I taught him everything he knows, but I've always loved him. I love him. And it's horrifying to realize I can't trust him anymore because I can't not love him. Jefferson didn't have that depth of feeling about Adams.
And we talked in the past about how Adams didn't stay for Jefferson's inauguration. And, we spoke to Mr. Ellis a couple of weeks ago about his book. And one of the things that he brought out was the fact that there really was no precedent for John Adams to stay for the inauguration. And he had a very sick child.
Dead.
And
his son Charles had died of alcoholism.
Right. And, so you take that into account, and all of a sudden, well, it wasn't really such an awful thing that Mr. Adams did by not being.
I actually think it was awful, but I take your point that the country was still figuring out how to do stuff like this.
I would contest that with maybe Adams thought protocol was for him to be out of the way. Out of sight, out of mind.
If Washington had not stayed for Adams' inauguration, believe me, Adams would have gone nuts.
I still think that was a little bit of a different situation.
Yeah, well, of course, the fact that Charles Adams, the son, had just died of alcoholism,
right,
and broke his parents' heart. They both, in this wonderful book by Ellis, he says that he was the favorite. He was the cheerful one. He was the convivial one. They had a special, he was a rogue, but they loved him.
But also in Europe, they talked about this unbelievable occurrence of this peaceful transition of power from one man to another. That's what Adams was looking at. But when Adams was looking at Jefferson coming in, it was this contested election that went how many ballots in the House?
36 ballots, yeah.
I think I give Adams the benefit of the doubt that he thought all things considered, needed to get home to Abigail, and that maybe it was best in the situation he was in to just disappear.
You know what I'm about to say.
Yes, I do.
You've always been an Adamsite. You are a secret Adamsite.
I've set myself up for that.
But fair enough. But the point is that Jefferson was a little miffed. Most constitutional historians believe that Adams should have done the right thing and stayed. But you have made a case that there were compelling private reasons. Adams might say, I have bigger fish to fry than your inauguration, sir. My wife is back home.
Or maybe he just said, that Jefferson's a schmuck. Why should I hand him a compliment?
I'm guessing schmuck wasn't part of his language,
Probably
but that's how
not.
he felt, I'm
Right,
sure.
okay.
Yeah.
Poor choice of words.
No,
as
it's
usual.
true. No,
Yeah.
not a bit. But the point is, I think that in spite of all that, they managed to reform their friendship, and it turned into be one of the greatest moments in American history when they start writing these letters to each other. And I mean, most things don't happen this way. Several times in my life, I've written to somebody that was an old dear friend of mine, and there's been an inevitable drift or a breakdown in some way. And I've actually sent them copies of the Adams-Jefferson correspondence and said, Adams said, we must not die till we have explained ourselves to each other. And I have kind of made that overture, and it has never actually worked.
You gave me a copy of
we
that
haven't had
years
that
ago.
trouble.
No, well, we can look forward to that. But you gave me a copy of that book, and it is so wonderful.
And think if they had not been able to work it out. We have to say all hail to Benjamin Rush, because he's the one who did it. He looked at these two guys who didn't want to even know each other anymore, and he said, you work it out. We're going to work this out.
Benjamin Rush just pops up everywhere.
He's an amazing man.
Yeah.
And he, you know what? He named Common Sense. It was going to be called Plain Truth. He said, no, let's call it Common Sense.
Thanks to Brooke Promnitz for that question. We have another letter here.
Thank you, Brooke.
Kind of on the same subject, the Adams family. And it comes from Bob Writing, who is a longtime listener and a member of the 1776 Club.
And we need more of them, though.
Right. It's a great way to support the show. Again, jeffersonhour.com. But he says he used to time shift record the Thomas Jefferson Hour programs. I'm not even sure. From Valley Public Radio in Fresno.
Right, where we have a great listenership.
And he recorded them on the CDs. He said he's saved all the CDs from 2002 to 2005, over 150 programs.
He has the second largest Jefferson archive after you.
He's begun to catalog them, and he'd like to he'd like to donate them to the show archive,
to the Smithsonian.
So we need to let him know who. So that would be the barn back room, right?
Yeah.
They're
we would love. I mean, what a great thing to offer. And yes, we want that, and please do catalog them.
So thank you very much for that.
That's fantastic.
And by the way, as a 1776 Club member, he has access to next week's show, the book on tape.
Is it true that you actually voiced Common Sense?
I did, and it was a great.
How long did that take you?
Oh, a few hours.
Were you your own engineer?
Long. I was.
And then you had to go back and fix when you made a verbal gaffe or a hiccup? You did this.
Yeah, that's the contest. First person to find a mistake.
Wow,
it's a tough
congratulations.
read, though. The English of that is very tough. But anyway, if you're a 1776 Club member,
you get David Swenson, the elusive Swenson, reading Common Sense.
That's right. His question: I know that John Quincy Adams had a unique view of the American Revolution and spent time traveling to Europe with Mr. Jefferson as a young man. It seems to me that he would have had a more favorable opinion of him, especially later in life when he and John Adams had reconciled. Was it his mother, Abigail, who negatively influenced John Quincy's view of Thomas Jefferson because of the shenanigans of the election of 1800, his father's influence, or something else? I suppose we can only guess.
That's a great question. I don't think it was Abigail, although she certainly didn't forgive Jefferson in quite the same way that her husband John did. But John Quincy Adams was a young man, young enough to be Jefferson's son. He didn't travel with Jefferson, but he was in Paris while Jefferson was there. And John Adams later famously said, he was almost as much your son as mine. You were mentoring him.
Bob includes in this. Right. It seems that early on, Jefferson was almost a father to John Quincy.
But then Jefferson drifted towards the radical end of the spectrum. He defended the French Revolution, and the Adams thought that was a bad idea. Jefferson's personal life was a little bit messy for the Adams, who were very much like the nuclear family. And then when Jefferson became the leader of the faction, the Republican faction, as against Adams, the Federalist faction, John Quincy Adams began to dislike Jefferson. And he, as a senator, he was a United States senator when Jefferson was the president of the United States, and he often went to dinner at Jefferson's White House. And, of course, the meals were great and the wine was great, and Adams loved all that. But he could hardly stand Jefferson. And one time Jefferson said that when he lived in Paris, it had been so cold that the Seine, the River Seine, which goes through the center of Paris, had frozen and people skated on it. And John Quincy Adams goes home and writes in his diary, that's not true. Jefferson tells tall tales. He tells whoppers. And he's always accusing Jefferson of exaggerating or telling whoppers or not being scrupulous with the truth. It turns out Jefferson was right. The river did freeze in that year in the 1780s. And so John Quincy Adams turned out to be wrong. And then when Jefferson's letters were published in 1828, a 3-volume edition of Jefferson's correspondence was carefully edited by his grandson, Thomas Jefferson Randolph. And now John Quincy Adams read the 3 volumes with great care, and like all Adams, He was a great record keeper, and his running quarrel with Jefferson is fun to read. He just couldn't stand Jefferson. He thought Jefferson was a demagogue, that he was a kind of a silly philosopher leftist, that he wasn't grounded in the real world, and he could not stand that Jefferson had been so hard on his papa, on John Adams, and so he never was able to forgive Jefferson. He admired him. Everyone admires Jefferson, but it's so, we both have been through this, David. It's so easy at some points to get into a mood where you don't really like Jefferson much for a while. I've done this. You've done this. It has to happen because there's something like Jefferson's always the guy who says the high-minded thing. You know, in any room, everyone else is like talking about life as it actually is. And then Jefferson is like this poseur who's saying the high-minded, idealistic thing. He's super polite. He never tells you how he actually thinks.
What's that lost in tranquility quote?
No doubt you was fast asleep in philosophical tranquility, said John Adams. John Quincy Adams wouldn't have been that polite. But Jefferson had that quality of like, you don't know who the real Jefferson is because he doesn't really let you have access to that person, but you do get access to this kind of magnificent philosopher prince. But then you know that he's paying some goon to write dirt about you behind the scenes and then denying it. He never admits that he's wrong. He frustrates people, Jefferson does. And the reason why people are frustrated with him in our time is like, all men are created equal, but he owns slaves, or he loves American Indians, but he dispossesses them. He's too much. He's above politics, but he's hiring Callender to write dirt. And so people today think, how can I trust a figure like Jefferson, who it seems like there's a reality problem, that it's illusion rather than the truth. Whereas with Adams, you get what you get. He tells you what he likes. He tells you what he doesn't like. He never had a thought that he didn't express. He's real. He's authentic in a way that Jefferson is more a pose. And so John Quincy Adams thought not only that, I mean, his pose is all the wrong one. That what, really? You think people are up to it? Look around. You know, you've seen Human Nature lately, Mr. Jefferson? And you're a slaveholder saying that people have inherent rights? Come on. If you're a slaveholder, you might want to shut up about human rights. You know? And that's how they felt. Like, that's how Samuel Johnson put it. He said, isn't it interesting that those who yelp loudest for liberty are also the drivers of Negro slaves? So John Quincy Adams is like, I get it. I get the magic of Thomas Jefferson. We all get the magic of Thomas Jefferson, the most elegant, refined, erudite, articulate person who ever lived. But you know what? He's maybe kind of a fraud in some important way. And my dad, who had this massive integrity, if ever a human being had just unbearable integrity, it was John Adams. And Jefferson is just rabbit punching him through life, just beating the living daylights out of him with little cheap shots and rabbit punches. When Jefferson's a hypocrite at heart, or certainly duplicitous at heart, and Dad, poor Dad, because he was real, had to be rabbit punched by this guy. And so I think that Abigail played a very small role in this. I think John Quincy Adams had it right up to here with the character and the style of Thomas Jefferson.
It doesn't even really matter in the big picture. I mean, this is centuries ago.
But it matters in that the big, as I say, the debate in American history is not between Hamilton and Jefferson. The debate is between Adams and Jefferson. Adams believed, of course we want a republic, but you better build some checks and balances into it because people are not always their best selves. And here's Jefferson saying, no, we can be our best selves. We'll grow peas. We'll have dinner parties. We'll learn ancient Greek. We'll prefer Homer.
Let me quote another author before we take our next break. David McCullough. In the introduction of American Spirit writes, history, I like to think, is a larger way of looking at life. It is a source of strength, of inspiration. It is about who we are and what we stand for, and is essential to our understanding of what our own roles should be in our time. History, as can't be said too often, is human. It is about people, and they speak to us across the years. So I guess that's why it's important, right?
Well, and Jefferson is one of the greatest men who ever lived. John Adams is a very great man of a different sort. Going back to the original question on this program, were they just average people who who in the crucible of events became extraordinary? To a certain degree, yes. But the fact is we are very, very, very lucky to have had this cluster of genius at the beginning. We haven't seen much of it lately.
Right now, we're going to take a short break, and hopefully we'll be talking to a new elected official when we return.
Young Beau.
Yes. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson or with the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. We're so pleased to have on the line Mr. Beau Wright. Welcome back, Beau. We haven't spoken for a while.
Well, hello, gentlemen. It's good to be with you.
And we're calling both of us to congratulate you. You are now an elected official. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. Well, and thank you very much. I am just been elected to serve on Lynchburg City Council in my hometown of Lynchburg, Virginia. So I'm one of 7 folks and one of 3 at-large members. The other 4 represent wards in the community, and so I'll represent the community as a whole, all 80,000 folks on City Council.
So, what's your goal? What's your vision? What are you going to do for the world of Lynchburg?
Well, we have a number of concerns in our community. Poverty, we have a 24.6% poverty rate in our city. So we desperately need to address that with real solutions. We have a vibrant economy, but we can definitely do a lot to strengthen it. And I think that we have a lot of work to do. We have great public schools, but we definitely have a lot of work to do improving our public education system. So those are the priorities that I'm going to be focusing on.
Well, a sincere congratulations from both of us. The reason we're calling you today is, well, it comes from a show we did a couple of weeks ago called Truth Matters.
Yes.
Which we used to think was true.
And we got a lot of response from listeners, both pro and con. And, I was thinking, you spent a lot of time in the White House. And I am certain that your time there, every president has to deal with inaccurate news reports, news reports that don't really meet your favor, things that you think should be presented better. How is that dealt with in the White House?
Certainly, you're exactly right. Every White House will dispute the accuracy of news stories that come out about its activities. And so we had every White House has a strong or should have a strong communications team that has relationships with folks in the media, with reporters, and can call them to sort of correct any inaccuracies. And hopefully they have that relationship and mutual respect. So I once heard a press secretary say that the first day that a journalist shows up to the White House press briefing room and doesn't ask me a hard question is a day that they're not doing their job. And a day that I don't respect them for asking me that hard question is a day that I'm not doing my job. So I think it starts with mutual respect from both parties. I think what we're seeing now, though, of course, is quite different from anything that we encountered, because we rigorously fact-checked any communication that was distributed by our White House. It went through multiple layers of review before it went out. And I think what you're seeing now, obviously, is the blatant dissemination of misinformation.
We mentioned the Washington Post's list of some 3,000 untruths that have been that have come out of the mouth of Donald Trump or out of his tweets since he took office. And a lot of people really objected to that and said, well, look, that's not fair. The Post is out to get him. They're part of the deep state that wants to destroy this administration. You're just succumbing to the liberal agenda and so on. And they said, for example, that President Obama made a much more grave lie when he said, if you want to keep your doctor, you'll be able to do it, and so on. That begin to unpack that and respond to that.
I disagree with the notion that if an administration official, or worse, if the president states something that is simply not true, a lie, that it's not harmless. I mean, it undermines the institution, undermines the integrity of the process, and it undermines our image around the globe. The lies have consequences, and I just don't agree that it's harmless, and that it's okay. It's just simply not okay. And so yeah, I do find it confusing that folks are willing to abandon an expectation of honesty and truth from their government. I was listening to your show from a couple weeks ago, Truth Matters, just the other day. And I think you said, Clay, that it's really confusing. What is up with that 35 to 40% of America who says, like, right on? And I have a hard time. I don't understand that difference.
I was just going to jump in and say, I had some real interesting back and forth correspondence with a couple of listeners who are self-declared conservatives. They look at this like it's time for America to stand up, be strong, take care of ourselves first, and they really don't care how that's done. They just want it done.
And I understand the impulse, and I understand wanting America to, President Obama got knocked for saying that America leads from behind. I think that was a phrase that folks really, really did not like. And so I understand the impulse to say, no, America's a leader, but it doesn't come from a place of dishonesty or a place of deceit or a place where, bald-faced lies are somehow considered acceptable. And it cannot be tolerated from the most important institution in the world, where markets rise and fall based on the words of a president. You have to insist. We have to insist on honesty in our government. And I would just say, stepping back, you referenced the Washington Post piece. Now, I haven't read it, and I haven't fact checked all of the 3,000 items that they outline. So I can't sort of comment on the veracity, but I would say that who has a better track record of telling the truth, the Washington Post or Donald Trump?
Well, they do have that article in the Washington Post. When they say 3,000, they're counting the same, what they consider lies, more than once. If he says it more than once, it counts again.
So they're not 3,000 discrete lies.
That's right.
Okay. But isn't that some? I mean,
it's
isn't that
worse,
semantics? Yeah. Does the number matter? Or is it the fact that he's lying to begin with?
I agree with you.
I guess my issue with this is that, you're saying that for the time that you spent in the White House, that there was a significant, even a strenuous effort to make sure that what came out of that building and out of the mouth of the President of the United States and his spokespeople was accurate, reliable, that it expressed the high-mindedness of the American system.
It's a question of, do we insist as Americans on honesty from our government and forthrightness? I mean, these are core American values that we're talking about. I don't know a parent in America who would say that they don't want honesty from their child. And so I don't think it's crazy to expect then that the White House, the most important institution in the world, practices that fundamental value. And again, our administration and previous administrations have gone to excruciating lengths to make sure that what we were presenting to the American people was true. And I don't mean to say, you also mentioned this on the Truth Matters show, that from time to time presidents and sort of in the business of conducting American policy will sometimes have to not fudge facts, but they will certainly have to for the purposes of negotiations, they might not have to be as forthcoming as they would ordinarily want to be. And so that's certainly true. A lot of politicians do that. But that doesn't excuse lying to people.
Let me ask you one last question here, Beau. We want to get you back on. We're so pleased for your commentary.
It's great to hear
people
your
ask
voice.
for you, but let me ask you this last question. The people on the right, it's always like, yeah, but what about Bill Clinton?
Sure.
But they're now saying that on the question of health care, for example, that President Obama lied to the American people when he said you could keep your doctor. I don't know the first thing about that. I wasn't there, but my sense is that he wasn't deliberately lying. It might have been a very bad thing to say, given how it worked out, but that this was not like, I'm going to go out and lie to the American people to sell this program. What's your sense?
To me, and actually I wrote a note down about that, that seems like something said during the legislative process that may just in the final calculus may not have turned out to be the case for a number of reasons. I'm not an expert on that, and I also don't want to make excuses for that. If that was said,
that's bad.
If that was said in a way that was clearly disingenuous and that was meant to mislead, then it deserves condemnation. Now, I don't know if that's the case or not. And even then, just because another president is purported to have done it, again, does not excuse the current president doing the same thing.
Of course.
Hey, Beau, thanks so much for taking time. I know, as Clay said, you're in meetings and you're giving up your break to talk to us. Let's talk again sooner.
Hey, I look forward
to it. And call us from the dining room at Poplar Forest.
I will. That perfect room,
That's the most Jeffersonian space in America. We want you to call us from there and see if the skylight is leaking.
Thanks so much, Beau.
I'll do it for you guys.
Thanks so much,
We love
Beau.
you. We'll talk to you soon.
It's always great to hear from Beau.
It is, and I can't believe that he's now a public figure. We met him when he was a staffer and then someone who was part of a foundation that wanted honesty in government and so on. Now he's in the arena, as Theodore Roosevelt puts it.
I remember the first show, getting the inside of the White House. But anyway, we could go on and on. But right now, sir, it is time for this week's Jefferson Watch.
Thank you, David. I've been reading a new book about the history of Rome, one of my favorite places on earth. It's called Rome, A History in 7 Sackings by Matthew Neal. I remember long ago reading a book about the history of the Oxford English Dictionary, which, by the way, Russ, I own and love in all 13 splendidly bound folio volumes. Thank you very much. The author said, "A dictionary is the history of a people from a certain point of view." Oh, it's just a fabulous insight. A dictionary is the history of a people from a certain point of view. You could write a history of Western civilization from the point of view of art, or architecture, or footwear. That was my friend Donald's notion. Or from the point of view of food, medical practices, theology, with a long train of et ceteras in every direction. For many years, I wanted to write a book called Ants in Western Literature, which is actually much more interesting than you might think. It started with a book my Uncle Joe gave me when I was just a child called White Patch by Angelo Petri. There is a famous mock epic in Thoreau's Walden featuring the black imperial ants at war with the red republican ants, at the end of which Thoreau says that while ants may seem fundamentally different from humans and humans from ants, the more you think of it, the less the difference. Thoreau's passage is perhaps the greatest of all mock epics, and that includes Alexander Pope's The Rape of the Lock, which Jefferson surely knew. But ants in Western literature may be a retirement project, and I don't suppose that I will ever retire. At the time I conceived the project 30 or so years ago, I reckoned that I would have to read through the corpus of literature of Western civilization to cull out all of the great ant references, which, if you think about it, is the glory of such a project. But now with the algorithms of the internet, it would be a comparative piece of cake to write that book, so it has lost some of its appeal to me. You've probably all seen books like Mark Kurlansky's Salt, A World History, or Jack Turner's Spice, The History of a Temptation, or B. Wilson's Consider the Fork, A History of How We Cook and Eat. There are tons of such books now, and though you might think the authors must be especially erudite, the fact is that a Google book search will do most of the heavy lifting. I almost said all the work in the salt mines of historical research. I am not done reading Neal's Rome, A History in 7 Sackings, but I can tell you that I have lectured on that subject when I take University of Mary students to Rome. It seemed like an ingenious thing to do, recounting something important from each of the main sackings of Rome, sackings that extend from 387 B.C. to the American bombing of the city on July 19, 1943. There have been a lot of sackings. Neil chose merely 7, 2 by Goths, 1 by Gauls, 1 by the Norman French. The Renaissance attacked in 1527 by the Spanish and the Lutherans. That one helped to enliven one of the world's great books, the autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini. And finally, the sacking by Napoleon's French forces at the end of the 18th century and the occupation of Rome by the Nazis in the 1940s. 7 sackings. When I was divorced, now 21 years ago, I made a vow that I would never again deny myself any book I wanted. This was either great liberation from the tyranny of marriage. Thoreau said in a similar context, every man has such a wife, which was meant to be less sexist than it may sound, or one of the worst decisions I ever made, because I am now essentially buried in books. So I was in Scotland with my daughter about 9 months ago. She took me to a bookshop. It's Britain. Marx called Britain a nation of shopkeepers, so bookshop, not bookstore. She had to go take care of some errand, so she left me alone for about an hour. What could be better than that? They even brought me tea, as I sat in a perfect book alcove with 3 or 4 probationary volumes. I saw Neil's book there, but because it was 412 pages long, I decided to wait until I got back to the United States and order it from Amazon.com. In short, I broke my divorce vow, and I wound up paying a very large price for it. The book was published in Britain a full year before it was released in the United States, so I had to do that pre-order thing on Amazon, and the book did not finally arrive until last week. I'm going to devour the book this week. Thomas Jefferson does not appear in the index, because when he had the chance in the summer of 1787 to peep into Elysium, as he put it, his sense of duty to his post as America's minister to France led him to turn back at Milan. He did not go on to Rome and Naples. That apparently would not have stopped Scott Pruitt, the director of the Environmental Protection Agency, who instructed his staff to make up reasons to send him at my and your expense to all the places he wants to see in the world. But Jefferson was another sort of public servant in another sort of America. Still, I wish he had overcome his scruples and visited Rome, Pompeii, and Herculaneum. I have spent dozens of hours sitting at an outdoor cafe in the piazza before the Pantheon in Rome, gazing at what I regard as one of the 3 or 4 greatest buildings on earth. Imagine Jefferson there, with his much more sophisticated sense of architecture and design and his deeper immersion in the classical past. I'm planning to lead cultural tours to Italy in the next couple of years. Go to our website, jeffersonhour.com, for details. Florence, Rome, Pompeii, and the great Palladio sites in north-central Italy. Wine, long walks through Rome, Virgil's Aeneid, the paintings of Caravaggio, the sculptures of Michelangelo and Bernini, the ruins of Hadrian's Tivoli. And I'm planning cultural tours of Homeric Greece, Jefferson's France, including the Canal de Midi, and Shakespeare's England. So here is my advice to you. If you are married, stay married. If you love books, never deny yourself a book, but know going in that you're going to have to build an annex. Read like the wind. You live in the greatest age of mobility in the history of the world. Rome, Paris, St. Petersburg, Istanbul, Cairo, London, Prague, Berlin, Edinburgh, Oxford, Stratford-upon-Avon, and Madrid are just waiting for you to visit. You don't have to be a corrupt post-Republican bureaucrat to plan your life around such journeys, and you'd be foolish not to see what you can of the great world, to peep into a much wider set of Elysiums that beckon us in a more multicultural global community today. I'm Clay Jenkinson. We'll see you next week for another exciting edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public Radio. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any past show for a $12 donation, please call 888-828-2853. Again, that number is 888-828-2853. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.org and on iTunes. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.org. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Music by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson.